Ladies and gentlemen, we're in a new unit, and new units come with new words. And since we've spent some time thinking about definitions, let's think about this word, fact. Fact is a very interesting word for our perspective because we can actually start to work with its definition and make it meaningful for us again. We live in an age, I think Stephen Colbert coined the term truthiness. You see it in the second sentence there, where people will treat facts as suggesting other facts, and sometimes treating those suggestive things as facts. But we're way too loosey-goosey about the language that we use. And so if we are attending to detail and attending to the precision with which language can help us communicate, as I've tried to encourage in other videos and in class, we need to work with some central agreed upon terms like fact, which comes from an older word, as you see there from the first full entry, that it means a deed or a thing done. That's a pretty serviceable term and doesn't rely on suggestive interpretation or seemingness or even truthiness. I think that we can actually rely on the word fact, a deed or a thing done. Now, again, we live in an age where, like we see with the pyramidal-haired co-worker of Dilbert down at the very bottom in the cartoon, she says, "I got your stupid email with a stupid link to that stupid scientific study. I don't care about your so-called facts. I know I'm right." Maybe you've had this argument. Maybe you know people who like to deal with only their own set of facts and no other, and sometimes that set of facts isn't a set of facts at all. It's really their interpretation of something that might have once been a fact. Since we're working with word precision, let's start with a deed or thing done. I think that's a good thing to start with. I have a student that I sometimes tell a story about who turned in a paper, and you'll see it in a future class, and the paper essentially said there are no such things as facts at all. And of course, I don't know what happened to the student. I think they came out of a philosophy class and were damaged somehow by ideas that we were all living in a dream and we're going to wake up someday. You know, I can't live with language that can be so abused, and that's not the world I live in. And so I turned back the student paper to the student, and I said, "Here's your paper and your grade on top, and that's a fact." All I can say is that we have to start relying on terms and concepts, and since we've spent some time already defining our terms, let's make sure that we can rely on the term fact. A deed or thing done, that's what it means. We're going to separate that from other words like inference, which can also be used to talk about interpretation or generalization, but I'm going to use inference. It may not be a word that you hear a lot, but I hear it quite frequently, and it means to bring or carry. It comes from an older term meaning to bring or carry. That's what we get when we look it up. Inference is very useful, and the etymology is even more useful because we can think about inference, interpretation, or generalization, meaning that we bring something to those facts and we carry something away. I think that's very useful. I'm going to come back to that concept in class and in videos, and also in your next assignment. Inference itself is not a fact. It is interpretation, of course. It's something that we carry away from the facts. Later on, we'll also talk about assumption, which means to take up, but more on that later. Since facts are frequently confused with opinions and non-facts, we need clarity insofar as we can give it. Here's a nice quote. I think people can recognize the truth here expressed by former Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Everyone's entitled to his own opinion, but not his own set of facts. How true is that? By the way, classes should give you truths. I think. It should give you things that, by and large, most people can agree upon, essential commonalities that are true to the human experience. Look for those in your study. They'll become very memorable indeed. New items, things to know. When we're working with facts, we judge the facts by their criteria. If it's a deed or a thing done, we can judge that deed or thing done by its verifiability. Something should teach us that something else happened. Either our senses should teach us that, or sources should teach us that. Our senses can verify things, but what if we weren't there? What if it's talking about Shakespeare's life, or Shakespeare's death even? We need to rely on sources to help us identify those things, and those sources must be authoritative. More on that in a future class as well. Verifiability must help us judge facts as a centerpiece for trying to judge what facts are and what they mean. But we can also add to that list of criteria with reliability, probability, plausibility. Those aren't absolutes, but the idea that we can reliably depend on facts to stay stable over the course of time, and that's the very last criteria, the standing the test of time. Accuracy, currency, all of those can help us test to see whether facts are indeed facts or something else. When we get into actually talking about facts, verifiability will probably be the most important. I think the others are important, and so we add those words to our list of testing for facts. The last of which I think is most essential, especially for the humanities, which tries to center itself on things that have stood the test of time. It follows that we have to have a care when describing facts. Now, look at that word description. You've just gotten done with a description assignment. We have to describe facts and have a care with describing them accurately. We have to have language that actually describes facts and not something else. Some language can render those facts very accurately. Some language will provide not just the facts, but also an interpretation about those facts. And we'll have a care to practice with that in class in more detail. Here's a brief digression, just to remind students who may not have already made the connection that what we're doing now really does connect with what came before. The bigger picture, of course, includes the weeks that we spent taking a look at observation and description and the use of the dictionary and of definitions that are meaningful. It says in my little slide here, a discussion of facts naturally follows observation and description, as well as our work with language and definition. I hope people can see the connection if we can start using language to describe apples, tomatoes, starfruit, kumquats. We can also use language to start describing language itself, such as ambiguous language or vague language or euphemistic language. We can use language also to describe the sensory world around us, such as the language of the word fact, and as we'll see in the coming weeks, inference and assumption. I hope people can see the connection. It's probably obvious to most students, but I just bring it in at this point because I think it bears repetition, and it's a good thing to just remind you that you've already started to pick up on. Furthermore, facts really are expressed differently and feel differently in our brains as we move to check them. Remember Samuel Scudder talking about that fish. That's kind of a centerpiece reading for us, just because we get to refer to it throughout the first part of the semester. He's describing the fish and describing the fins, or describing the lateral line, or describing the organs, or describing the symmetry of it and how it's paired. When you describe something factually, it will feel like language that is factual language, and you'll start to get used to that as we draw our attention to it. All of those criteria that we use to judge facts, verifiability, reliability, probability, plausibility, accuracy, currency, and the fact that it stands the test of time, those are our checks that we get so used to once we use the language appropriately that we just have it as second nature in us. We don't have to spend a lot of time bringing it to our attention again. We do not use the criteria that's down at the very bottom of this slide, the fact that it may not at first agree with what we believe, which has nothing, of course, to do with facts per se. We're not trying to judge people or their interpretations, and that's not what this is about. But the point must be made that something isn't non-factual just because we don't agree with it. It has to really satisfy these other criteria that have been commonly accepted through the course of time and through the best understanding that we have of that word fact. Statements of probability can be the nearest things, it says in the slide, that we have to facts in the sciences. Their certainty is pretty good, better than the way we usually think of the word probable. Then next, feelings can be facts. That's going to be the shocker for some students. But the fact that you can feel like something is off. Facts can lead us to discover verifiable facts. Here's the point where I pause in taking a look at a slide to talk about a student, and I'll try and show his paper in class, who wrote about his platoon in Iraq and how something felt off while he was out on patrol with his colleagues, with his platoon. Something felt off, which led him to discover facts, real facts that he could verify. But at the time when he first felt it, it was a subjective feeling. The fact that he had that feeling can be a fact, even though it doesn't seem like it's factual. And be surprised at how in investigations they will actually ask people whether they were tense and nervous, whether they were relaxed and calm. Those things can affect how other facts are perceived, and so they can be factual as well, the fact that you have those feelings. I ought to pause here and just separate it out. People will discount that business of subjectivity all the time. We're having more of a care here because some subjective responses can factor into how we think about facts. Now that'll be the most confusing part, I think, for some students. So I hope we get to talk about it in more detail in class and that you get to ask questions. Using the statement, to continue on with the slide, it's all subjective, will no longer be as effective if we are serious about it. Because what? Subjectivity, again, can lead us to discover other things. I still take my car to the mechanic who subjectively can feel like the engine has something off about it. He may not be able to identify it right away. I just did this, and so I can relate to this right away. The mechanic I have is really good when he's driving the car around and something feels off, but he's going to investigate it further to see whether he can spot the facts that led to that feeling. Okay. I actually value his subjectivity, and it's a fact that he has it. Why not talk about it as fact? Here's our last slide. Goofus quickly judges facts based on whether he agrees with them. We know that we're not goofus, though you may know some goofuses in your life. People who can only accept such facts around them as correspond with their internal sense of reality and can accept no other facts. Well, if he doesn't accept the fact that he's running with that scissors, he's going to have a lot of problems. Gallant knows the value of being careful to check for facts and how he expresses facts. In fact, it seems so obvious to us, but we want to be careful about checking for facts, observing them, right, but also describing them as factual statements. It should be second nature to us, and yet it bears a little bit of scrutiny and maybe even a little bit of repetition through the next couple of weeks in our next assignment, that facts are as we observe and describe them, and in order to do that, we need to do that accurately and precisely.